couple of days ago, I recorded this conversation with Sharif Labban. Sharif's a UX designer, but his background is in classical music composition and psychology. The last couple of years, he's worked with some big brands in Australia, but now he's back in New York looking for his next design gig. I wanted to chat to Sharif about the creative process for music and design to see what the parallels and analogies were. So that's what we did. He's a great guy, super smart, and I hope you take as much away from this chat as I did. Thanks for taking the time to speak to me today.
Yeah, of course.
Would you mind giving us an introduction to your training in music?
Sure, yeah. I guess the short story would be I started when I was like 3 years old this is like precedes my memories to this, but I apparently really loved the violin. And we were in New York. There was one of those like one-man band kind of guys, and he just like blew my mind, loved the violin, really wanted to play, and never like stopped caring about it from a really young age. Still don't know what it was that drew me to it, but I took lessons and got involved in like youth orchestras and small chamber groups. We had a piano at the house, so I started to really just play with the piano. Like didn't want lessons, didn't want to do anything. It was literally just, oh, that sounds good, oh, that sounds bad, just having fun. And I think I wrote my first piece when I was 6 or 7. It's called Sharif's Song on the violin. Is it like in crayon? It was, yeah. But I just had that kind of instinct when I'd be told to play a piece, and it was written this way, and I'd be like, I think it sounds better like this. And they're like, this is this guy called Mozart. You don't really get to make this decision, 6-year-old Sharif. Like, you have to play it this way. I'd be like, no, but I want to play it this way. So it was just a very natural kind of curiosity with why I thought some things sounded better, some things I wanted to change. And I was very lucky to have a very supportive family who kind of just let me run with that and kind of get me talking to the right people. And through high school, I really got into music theory, playing all different sorts of instruments. I was in rock bands. I was really into musical theater and like pit bands, and how like big productions have all these different moving pieces that collaborate to come together to kind of create art. And I eventually had to decide if I wanted to go to a conservatory or not. And looking at my options when I was 16, 17. Yeah, conservatory. So, that was what pretty much everybody was telling me. It was like, you'd be great in music. And as I started to look into that, it was pretty much like performing or teaching or going back into academia as a scholar were kind of the career paths. And it felt almost like a little claustrophobic. Like, I think I was like, I could do that. Performing was scary because that's like 8-9 hours a day by yourself, honing your instrument. Like, it's really hardcore competition, and that kind of freaked me out a little bit. So I just was like curious to explore something else, had no idea what it was. So eventually decided I'll go to a liberal arts school where I can study music and something else. And that something else ended up being psychology. And I went to Duke University, which didn't have a music school, but had a really big music department and a really big art scene. So a lot of people were kind of using music and art as another outlet for something else they were studying. So that really appealed to me. And that's where, without really realizing it, I was getting my foundation for UX design. And throughout Duke, I was dealing with 2 very separate sort of departments, with like the psychology department and the music department. No one really pieced together, hey, there's like UX design and like design schools, and this would play off, these aspects of your creativity and your more analytical thinking and your research background and all this stuff. So that all came after my undergraduate degree. But yeah, the curriculum at Duke around music was very like theory heavy, a lot of music history. And there was a small group of us who were looking to major in composition, and we took a lot of classes that were, very small groups, 5-6 people with a professor, just trying to hone these ideas and really get exposed to just how much work and art and music has come before, and just try to get exposed to ideas that have come before. It's kind of in a nutshell.
That's something I find quite interesting about your skill set and your background, is you've got the mix of the love for the creativity and the art, but you're also very analytical. And I think you see that within music. some people just love to create, free form, just flow, let it come out. Other people love to study the theory. And when you think of creativity, you don't really think about the theory that underpins it all. But it's interesting that you went for psychology and music, because it's kind of playing up the contrast between those seemingly polar opposites.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it's worth noting that both my parents were engineers, so like highly analytical and like very linear. My dad teaches math in high school now. He's, so they're very analytical minded. And I guess that's definitely part of my nature, but it's really similar to like, music theory is a lot of the grammar of music that you don't really, not everybody needs to know it. And if you look at like super influential musicians, often they're playing with like it's much more of like a visceral thing that's kind of driving them, as opposed to a more like mathematical view of what they're doing. And, especially if you think about like a guitar soloist who is just like pouring themselves into what they're playing, they might have a theory background, but they might not at all. And it's just this pure feeling that's kind of coming out of them.
Yeah.
And the music and the instrument is just kind of a conduit to let that idea out. And you can go in and look at the math around that after the fact. And I do think knowing that can help you learn an instrument faster and understand, like how ideas are put together, but you certainly don't need any of that background. And that's honestly why I think a lot of people are turned off by music theory, is because it's dry and it's really tough to kind of get into the rhythm of the Roman numerals and all this notation. And if you do learn it, it's helpful, but it's certainly not necessary.
So the people that play without knowing any theory, are they intuiting the rules, or are there so many rules that by playing good, you're kind of aligning to them? Do you know what I mean? Because there's different types of music, there's different scales, there's different chords.
That's a really good question. I think the different types of music is a big piece of that. So immediately I'm thinking about singers that I've worked with who can't read music. And this might touch a nerve for some of the listeners, and I'll try to tread lightly here. But there are a lot of singers who are phenomenal at controlling their voice and projecting and having stage presence and just like telling a story through singing. And they cannot read music at all. And this can be really challenging as somebody who's accompanying one of these singers. Like I usually was doing the piano, sometimes guitar, but you might get in situations where a singer's like, not really feeling it today, can we do it a little bit lower? And that is like a lot of math that you have to do to be able to take a piece, and then it's called transposing it so that it will sound the same, but it just kind of starts and ends on a little bit lower, higher note. And certain singers can appreciate that that's hard. Other singers are just like, no, half is low. Yeah, about there. And they have, like no more or less musical ability, and they can perform that piece and really like capture the attention of an audience. But I do think certain types of music it's easier to kind of go with and just kind of feel it out. And then there are certain types of music where it's pretty rigid in the rules. And if you don't know the rules, it'll be obvious to anybody who does know the rules.
Yeah.
Jazz might be a good example of that, where there's actually a lot of technical stuff there, and you might get a jazz musician who doesn't know theory and can just kind of go with it and sound it out. But normally it's a lot of, like playing off of patterns that they understand well and that they are then manipulating in a way that's really interesting. So it does depend on the type of music a lot, I think.
Well, I guess by knowing the theory, like you say, it opens it up because you can play it in different ways, but it probably enables you to be more creative in a sense as well, because you can be creative with the ideas of theory. So rather than saying, I feel like playing this thing, you can say, what if I play these alternating notes with these chords and mix them up and change them around? Kind of introduces a different way in, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's also, I'd say it's a lot faster to think through musical ideas if you understand theory. Mm-hmm. So like you might see there's like compilation videos where it's like a million songs that kind of have the same 4 chords, And they might change the order of the chords or change the tempo or the lyrics around it, the melody to it. But fundamentally, those pieces can be represented by like just a handful of Roman numerals in music theory. And that's really helpful if you're hearing an idea, because you can say, oh, that's like a 1-4-5 progression. And that means actually a lot. There's a lot of information that's packed into that. And if you know the key, so you're in the key of C major and you're going to play 1-4-5, anybody who knows their music theory can actually do a lot with that. So there's like an efficiency to being able to talk about music if you understand some of the basic points of theory. And then that does become a really good foundation to say, well, what if I go like 1-2-4-5 or 1-6-4-5? And somebody else might be able to feel that out, or maybe it's by accident, or maybe they just have that in their head and they don't know what to call it, but when they hear it, they know that's what they were looking for. But if you know the language, like a good example might be like, do you speak like Spanish or Italian? No,
a few words
here and there, probably like swear words and greetings and that sort of thing. But it uses the same letters as English. So if you wanted to, somebody could kind of give you a paragraph in Italian and you could kind of be trained how to pronounce them correctly and like deliver a monologue in Italian without having any idea what you're really saying. But somebody could kind of like, train you and shape that, the way you're pronouncing it, phrasing and all that sort of stuff. So you're speaking Italian, but you would learn that a lot faster if you knew Italian and you could understand the whole phrase, and this is kind of where you put the accents and that sort of stuff. So that's like knowing music theory is knowing the language, and then it makes it a lot easier for you to like come up with something in Italian, for instance.
So there's like a science and a formula to the creative process in a sense. In that,
there can be. I mean, and I think there's definitely like, so a big part of my curriculum was learning like different schools of thought that historically have been used to come up with a lot of music. So when you think about like Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, he wrote a lot of music for the church that had like super strict rules. And the instruments they were using it was like a very tight group of instruments that they're using. The purpose of the music was all the same. So he was working within like a really narrow paradigm. And that's why all of the music from him and a lot of his predecessors sort of have the same sort of feel to it. And it's a similar sort of thing with like the Beethovens, Mozarts, Haydns. They have another sort of feel to that sort of music, and it's another kind of subset of rules. Mm-hmm. And those were often like very explicit, like things you do, things you don't do. And I think throughout history, you have groups of people who kind of adhere to certain schools of thought around how music should come up with. And then you have people who come in, they do their own thing. There's been tension where people will say like, no, you can't do that. If you write this music, you cannot call yourself, French, because this is the way the French are writing the music at this point in time, whatever it is. And then you have like the Debussys and these guys coming in. It's like, I'm doing it. I'm gonna write it this way. I think it's awesome. And that can totally change the trajectory of culture and the way that people write music. So you get it from both sides.
Okay, so that's interesting because people are picking the constraints that they play within. So it's like, I am going to create something. I don't know what the outcome is, but before I do it, I might have a feeling for what genre it should be. So I'm going to pick these constraints and work within those constraints. And I guess a part of that is also how do you change those constraints and move outside those constraints to put a different spin on it. And I think that's when you're getting then to, you can't be French if you play that because you are changing it.
Yeah, and there's definitely been, a lot of different groups who would die for their rules of like not just music, but the art that they were creating, and that was representing them and having. And I think an important question too is, why are these people creating this stuff? And this is a huge difference. I think one of the main differences between like what I was doing creating music and art and what I do now as a UX designer is, why are you doing this? And I'd say the simple answer is that art is for its own sake usually, and design usually has a utility, trying to add value to a business or to customers in some way. Or, there's usually something pretty concrete and you get down to like KPIs and ways of measuring how design works.
It's like
music
art with intent.
Yeah. I like that. I'm gonna put that on a poster. I think I like that. It's a good one.
Sounds good. I don't know if it's quite accurate.
Yeah.
But...
Well, there's so many different reasons someone might come up with a piece of music, right? And throughout history, some people, that was their job. Yeah, whether it was for the church or the school, or they were, paid for by the royalty to do it in a certain way. They had expectations around that. There have been composers who've been influential who were absolutely starving and like had no recognition in their lifetime, but just had a belief or had some sort of motivation that kept them creating this stuff. And this was a big reality check for me, coming up with ideas and then trying to piece that into like making rent and feeding myself. Because when you're trying to get a commission or writing a piece for a competition, you do have to kind of understand what those expectations are, if there are rules in place, and taking feedback to say, oh, you didn't win this, but you're a finalist. And that was amazing to be a finalist in like a big competition. Like that's happened very few times for me. And it was always just this like incredible honor to be even considered. But it does leave a lot of questions, like what should I have done differently? And if it's something where I was like, I made this piece the best I could. I thought from the second it started to the moment it finished, it was super interesting. It was a cool idea. There was no wasted time. And I loved every element of it. And then to be told, you don't win. What do you do with that? That can be really challenging to then be asking, well, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I love it and I think it's as close to perfect as it can be, and I got to walk away because I'm just going to be making it worse if I try to change anything now? It's too close.
Yeah.
Or do you have to then go to say, well, what is this other person or this other group looking for? And how do I write something that they're going to see and they're going to love and they're going to pick as better than everything else? And it's a tough question to kind of wrestle with. And for me, it was always there was just something really joyous about getting lost in a piece and just running with it. And there's a very childlike kind of curiosity to it. That honestly, I lost touch with when I started having to like trying to write and, make ends meet and working part-time jobs, a lot of stuff in hospitality and that sort of thing to make ends meet. It did kind of take a lot of the joy out of it, because it wasn't just like, oh, I love this idea. It was like, is this competition? These guys have not even given me a second look the past 3 years that I've applied. They're going to hate it. Right off the bat, you have that kind of thinking where it's like, oh, no, this is a great idea, but I think I have to do it this way. And then it became a lot more like work, and a lot less joy. Yeah. And I guess, an interesting kind of aside here too is like the word amateur is like, I think the best way to look at, like for myself, how I approach music. And the root of that word is amour, is love. Like you're not doing it for a profession, you're doing it for the love of it. And now that I've gotten into design and I'm able to do that 10, 12 hours a day if I need to, and I can, make ends meet that way, it's left me to be able to look at music and just that pure, for the love of it. So I'm very lucky that I've been able to kind of find this path from trying to get into it professionally, having, those reality checks, and then now being able to come at it from, just a much more flexible and like keep it kind of, I don't know why childish has a negative connotation most of the time, but I want to use it in a positive way here. There's like a childish love of music that I have that I want to stay in touch with.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the definition or etymology of amateur. And I'm going to start describing myself as an amateur from now on and take pride in that.
Oh yeah. Own it.
But it's a shame that what gets you to that level to where you can compete, I don't know if it's fair to compete about things that you're creating and feeling, because like you say, is there really a right or a wrong? But what gets you there is the love for it. And then once you get there, it becomes something else entirely. Like you say, it's playing up to the judges. It's trying to meet a consensus view of what the audience wants. And I felt something very similar within design. Like I didn't start designing because I wanted to make money or even because I wanted to design products. I was just having fun and enjoying playing with the software. And I wouldn't have sat there for like the whole summer in my bedroom just playing with software and doing stickman animations,
Mm.
if there was so much pressure, and if I knew that I was going to be judged for it, and if I knew that I could be told that I'm doing it wrong when I'm not, I'm just exploring and experimenting. And I think that's something that we miss within industry now. Like, where's the time to explore truly to that extent? It's hard to fit in, obviously, because you have backlogs and you have deadlines and you have budgets. But this is why side projects, I think, are important, because you still get to explore as an amateur and then bring that back into the work that you do day to day.
Absolutely. And I actually see a lot of aspects of design thinking, and particularly like workshops in design thinking, are trying to get people into that exploratory mindset. And in my experience, at least, there are really solid ways to get there, where you hear a lot about like having a safe space, and not if you're going to throw out an outlandish idea, that you're not going to look like a fool in front of your boss or executives or by your teammates and stuff. And I think a lot of this is kind of circling around giving people that space to just play.
It's trying.
And trust that there will be the reality checks of the deadlines and the budgets and backlogging and road mapping that will have to, you'll layer it in, you'll temper it in later, and that will sort of weed out what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But to give that people that space at the forefront to just kind of go wide and to have fun with it. And I think I remember at SportsBet, some of the workshops that I was running were dealing with such diverse groups of people. And if you could get a group of people who were coming at things from like wildly different backgrounds into the mentality that it's like, we're just spitballing here. Sharpies, Post-it notes, doesn't matter if you know it's not going to work. Shout it out. Because if that can spark something in somebody else, and you get a whole group of people kind of in that mentality that it's like, well, I don't know, it probably won't work, but maybe there's something there, then you do get really cool ideas, and people kind of check themselves, where it's like, not like, oh, that's not going to work, we can't do that. It's like, oh, well, bear in mind, if like, I remember once it was some back-end engineer who was talking about what a computer system could do to kind of hack the system, and nobody had any idea what he was talking about. Everybody's like, oh, this is cool. And he's like, no. And we're like, I'm like, what are you thinking? What are you seeing? And he could have easily come in and be like, this is a security risk, and like, we will be just dismantled by robots if you put this out into the world. You can't do it. But he's like, you're forgetting about this element. And he kind of took a moment, kind of taught people, and there was that curiosity in the room, not people being like trying to defend their idea, but just being like, how are you seeing it? Okay, you're seeing something I don't know anything about. And it was like a very sort of just playful banter around people sharing their experiences. And like having the willingness to be wrong, but not for that to be personally, to be like, well, I'm not a data science expert. I don't know what sort of security paradigms you're talking about, but like, bring it into the room and let's see what we can come up with.
That sounds like the ideal scenario. If you
can
are
happen.
a good, I mean, it's great when you do see that, when everybody truly trusts each other within the room and they can speculate out loud without fear of being judged. And I think then that's obviously the role of a good facilitator, is making the space to be creative by putting people with multiple perspectives, but then giving them the constraints, but also bringing the inputs and the insights that are going to direct that creativity. And it's kind of like throwing a load of things into a melting pot and watching it meld together and create something new, which I think is a great analogy for the creative process, because I see it as connecting dots. It's about taking inputs, interpreting different things, and combining them into something that is new. And it's the quality really of the inputs.
Something that I've noticed is there is like, there's so many similarities to, because I've done a lot of work with young kids in music schools and studios and that sort of thing, and taking like a group of kids under the age of 10 and just throwing them into a band room with like drums and guitars and pianos and like bongos and just stuff for them to get their hands on, like they while out. And it's usually like absolute chaos, but it's a very similar dynamic to people being like, what did you do? How did you make that noise? Like, I want to do that. And then kind of like sharing and showing each other. And just like, if you look at one kid with like a drum set or something, like in their own head, it's like they are John Bonham, they are Keith Moon, and they're just having the time of their life. And that's something that's very natural for kids that we're kind of taught is like not a good use of time, waste of resources, outlandish. And you do have to, I think it's really important to temper that divergent thinking and letting people just go explore, see what they can come up with, have a way to share perspectives, kind of check and balance each other with their teams, and then eventually roll that down into kind of the hard reality of what you can do. And even if it's something that's just a nugget of an idea that will need a lot of work and might get turned into something totally different by the time it's on the other side of that pipeline, you want that same culture that you would in a room of kids to be able to share instruments, not start beating each other over the head with them and hoarding stuff and attacking each other, but to just be like, hey, that's cool. How'd you do that? And then to get them to actually work together like that. We are all kids with just instruments whiling out at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think it's the mix of the two, right? It's how you describe the amateur, someone that's doing it for the love and they're tinkering and they're experimenting. And then it's taking that and giving it some purpose. And it's like the relationship between the inventor and the innovator, where the inventor and the innovator thrive under different conditions. The inventor needs to be left alone to experiment and explore. And the inventor will bring something new into the world that didn't exist before under those conditions. And then the innovator comes in and finds out a way to apply that and give it a purpose and do something different with it. But they both thrive under different conditions. So the inventor would create a new technology. The innovator would then create a business model around it. But by trying to do the same thing at the same time and not recognizing that there's a difference, I think you'd be banging your head against the wall quite a lot. Like trying to create the space to invent, but really it's just crazy eights within an ideation session. I don't know if it's enough time. For me, ideas come from the processing time in between thinking time. I think that's where we need to bake in more of that. Not thinking time, but processing time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and something that I've kind of come to learn. Because I've taught composition classes for like young kids before, and I've get people ask me like, how do you, I really like that. How did you come up with that? And I've never had like good answers for people. And I've always had to just be like, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out and, have to, kind of BS something so I don't look like just a total fool. But there is two things. One, people are, you just mentioned processing time. Like people learn differently and people create differently. And I do believe everybody's creative on some level. And if you tell yourself you're not, that's the first thing you can do to be more creative is just stop telling yourself that you're not. Because every day you wake up, you have to come up with solutions to the problems that kind of present themselves to you. And people create in all sorts of different ways. So that's an important thing to kind of bear in mind if you're an ideator, an innovator, and you're a manager trying to oversee, you're trying to set up the instruments in the room and invite all the kids in to kind of have this space, and you want to have that end goal of a Kid Rock concert a month from now. You want to have that understanding that people operate slightly differently, and to just sort of recognize what are going to be the environment, what's the environment, what are the conditions and the timeframes, that sort of thing, for individuals to have the best sort of creative output. And sometimes you'll get people who they're more extroverted, they want to work in a group and talk and work together. You get people who want to go more siloed and come back and check in. So important to just sort of be present and aware with what your team, your team is kind of geared. And for me personally, I've noticed that there is this sort of pattern that I've noticed with like architects that I've talked to and fashion designers. I've heard this a lot with like screenwriters and different sort of authors. But this is something I've had not for all of my pieces, but some of I think what I would consider like my best works that I'm happiest with. There's a 3-stage sort of process, which is like researching, figuring things out at a really lofty high level. then a lightning fast, like 2-3 day period where I pretty much write the whole thing as a skeleton, and then another long tail fine tuning, like up to minutes before the thing is performed, like just tweaking the tiniest little things that nobody is going to notice except for me and maybe the performer. But that sort of 3-stage process I've heard a lot of people talk about a lot in different sort of ways, and I think there is something to that general sort of pace of creating something.
Yeah.
And yeah, people might need to work a little bit faster or slower in different parts, but having kind of that big sort of thing, and then getting that whole idea out with, a sort of a single mindset where you can kind of feel like you see the whole thing, and then having a lot of time to put in all of the bells and whistles and clean it up is something I feel like I see that everywhere.
I read somewhere, paraphrasing, but it was something like writing is 20% writing, 80% editing, or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
It's quite an efficient way of doing it. But what does that say about, when you said that there's a part of the process where you kind of just like stream it, you just like let it all out? That part of the process feels quite interesting because you're just like releasing it, and then you're being critical about it and organizing it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And for me, I'm like very critical about it. And I can be like cruel to myself with just like trying to push something further and further. A really interesting interview I heard, I think this was with Jackson Pollock, and I asked him, he does, it was like very revolutionary at the time, but just a lot of like splatter and like kind of chaos sort of paintings. And he was often like nailing his canvases to the floor and standing on them and painting in like what would have been, I imagine, like a very alarming way if you're used to someone kind of like, looking at something. And then this guy is just like making a huge mess and sort of starting to, and somebody asked him, like, aren't you worried about, like, how do you know if you're gonna do some big motion like this, you're gonna dump a bunch of paint on this canvas, are you worried about messing it up? And paraphrasing, he said something about being in tune with the life of the piece. And he's like, if I'm in tune with the life of the piece, I can't mess it up. But as soon as I start to detach from what the life of the piece is, then I can't do anything, because it's not going to be what the piece is. And there is definitely something to an idea in its early stages having momentum and having velocity, and sort of you then are the conduit to let that idea out. And I've heard this actually particularly with screenwriters for TV shows, where it's like the show gets going. I think I'm thinking about a Breaking Bad interview maybe, and all the writers in the room, they had all these ideas for what they wanted the characters to do, but it got to the point where they had to go, what would Walter White do in this circumstance with everything that's just happened? Not what we want to film, not what we think would be cool, or the ideas we had 6 months ago when we were starting this. Like, what would, and this character had so much velocity behind him that it just sort of it didn't write itself, but the direction was there. And then the writers are simply there to kind of keep that direction going. And I've definitely felt that with a lot of musical ideas, where they just get going and then you are just trying to figure out how to keep that momentum going.
Yeah, that idea of being in tune is an interesting idea. It's like, is that flow?
I mean, flow is a really interesting,
what is flow?
Like, phenomenon. Flow is a state, it's like a drive state that people can get into. This psychologist's name, I have practiced pronouncing so many times in preparation for this, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to say it correctly because it's a mouthful.
We'll dub it afterwards.
She sent me high, I think. This is, please look at this guy's name because it is long and hard to pronounce. But he coined this term flow, and the way that I would describe it is a merging of action and awareness, and it's a very positive state. It feels really good. You will hear athletes talking about this. A lot of people who are on stage performing in whatever their craft is will often experience these sort of out-of-body kind of experiences where time sort of slips away and they are just watching themselves perform. And this usually happens when it's something that's very difficult, that's requiring a lot of attention, but that also is well within your skill set, that you've practiced a lot and that you're really good at. So it's difficult, but you are very well prepared to do this. And a lower kind of state might be driving, where difficult, not too challenging. Normally, you're very comfortable with it, and it's that experience where you are kind of just home all of a sudden, and you zone out a little bit, and it's usually a very enjoyable experience. And for me, it's normally come from performing on like a tough piece in front of a lot of people, and it's like full adrenaline, and I'm just like, I've been panicking for weeks, and I got to get on stage, and suddenly I'm just kind of watching myself do something really difficult, and it's very hard to explain.
Would you be self-aware?
Yeah, it's literally like you're watching yourself.
Okay.
It's literally like it almost feels passive, like it's just going, but you are so present in the moment of what's happening, and you can just kind of watch. For me, I'm doing this because I'm imagining like playing like violin and viola pieces, and I'm just kind of watching my fingers do this stuff, where in the past I've been putting a lot of cognitive effort into the feel of everything and thinking what's coming next, and all of a sudden I'm just like out of body, kind of watching it happen. And like, I've literally had thoughts where it's like, hope I don't mess this up. Like, this would be a really bad time to make a mistake, because I don't think I would be able to continue. Like, I'm just I'm suddenly an observer to this whole thing. And I've heard like athletes talking about that, making a play, sprinting down the field, and suddenly they are just like watching this whole thing sort of happen in slow motion. And they hit some crazy intricate shot that everybody's like, that was incredible. How'd you do that? Like, it just happened. I don't even know. Just got into that flow state.
Would you feel anything comparable to that at work as a product designer?
Ooh,
imagine looking over at Sharif's desk. He's in the flow right now.
Yeah, don't interrupt him. He's in flow.
He's just madly just stashing his brushes over the desk.
There would be certainly, actually, like the closest that the thing that's coming to mind is when I've like led big workshops and I've been in front of a lot of people. Yeah. And having to like explain something, or just even if it's just like setting the stage. I did a big I was the MC for a tech conference at Sportsbet a few years ago. And that was like, that was intense, because that was the most amount of people I've ever had staring at me where I didn't have a musical instrument. Normally I got something to kind of, there's some sort of buffer and I can kind of use the piano or something. And suddenly I have like everybody I've ever worked with looking at me, and I'm trying to be funny. I was in a suit, like a whole like polyester MC Hammer kind of nightmare. So that was like a pretty intense situation. But there were a few moments throughout the day when, we were doing this massive kind of design thinking inspired activity where we had split everybody up into subgroups. They all had kind of design thinking facilitators at their groups. And we were doing a big ideation session on evolving the strategy for the department, and the pillars they were going to go after and how they were going to realize that over the next few years. And this is something that had worked with a lot of people, had just tons of meetings about this in the coming weeks, a lot of anticipation. And there were a few moments during that where I'm explaining the activities that we're going to do and how this is going to go, where I'm like hearing my voice echo, and I keep getting these blinding glimpses of like the neon clothes that I'm wearing. And that was kind of bringing me back a little bit to reality. But yeah, that was close to a flow state where it was just sort of happening and it was all well rehearsed. So, I was just kind of like floating along. But in terms of like creating something, like actually designing and ideating, I think that's a lot tougher. I'm trying to think of anything that really came close. And maybe it was a few, like a whiteboard session or something. I think it would have been something personal, probably. Just me in a room or by myself, like just with my pen and paper, and kind of getting into that same sort of mindset. But I think it's different when you have such concrete goals that, like typically that's all within, and even if it's like a hack day or something where it's like, all right, no holes barred, like go off and just come up with whatever you want. There's still like, oh, well, I want this person to be impressed, or like, this is a problem that I've been thinking about for months that would be cool to come up with a new idea. So there's still something kind of concrete that I think has maybe stopped me from getting into like a full flow state personally.
I can agree with, I think for me, the times when I've spoken publicly or presented to a large group, like, and I've experienced that contrast of like being anxious and nervous and the adrenaline, and then switching into a state of like pure calm where the words are just coming out and you're just doing it. Like I definitely experienced that, and I I have felt that it's kind of a passive thing because things are just happening seemingly without my like conscious direction. But with designing things, I think you've kind of touched on there, it's more of, it requires active participation because you're thinking about a challenge or a problem quite often. And it requires deliberate thought. It requires one thought to inspire another thought to inspire another thought, like a chain. And, you know, it reminds me of the book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow.
Yeah.
So can you recall the principles behind the two? It's one that is like,
I mean, yeah, like it's essentially like your like intuitive mind and your rational mind. Might be kind of two ways to look at it. So I guess if you were to look at your brain as having, there's a way of looking at your senses where you have 33 senses. And, you know, if you think about sight, you can perceive like depth and color and brightness and, you know, clarity and all sorts of different sorts of senses. So your brain is overwhelmed with a lot of stimuli, and you have a finite amount of attention that you, sitting in your brain, can kind of focus on from one thing to the next. So the way that your fast and slow mind kind of interplay is that you're kind of presented with this just like overwhelming, too much information for you to process at once. And your intuitive mind kind of takes a stab at like piecing that together in some sort of rational way. And then your slower mind can kind of come in and go over that sort of like initial analysis that your fast mind did. And depending on the work and your energy and how much you're going to actually like look at that and think about that, you can then sort of change that or go with it, or, you know, people think in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
There's so many great examples in that book that can kind of illustrate this. I'm trying to think of one that you could do sort of verbally. But there's a lot of good word problems and things. I think there's one, if you have a ball and a bat, and the total cost of both of these is $1.10, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? So the intuitive answer is 10 cents. And if you see it, if you're a visual thinker, it's really easy to go, yeah, that's $1, ball's 10 cents, $1.10, what's the problem? And I'll give you some time, and, you know, listeners, there's some time to let their slow brain kind of come in and determine if that's a correct answer or not. You probably guess there's some trickery there, but it's really 5 cents and $1.05.
Yeah.
So there's it's a great book. Daniel Kahneman, I think, is the author, and it's a good. I think it can get a little jargony with a lot of the psych terminology there, but it's so succinct in what it's explaining around these big systems of thought. And actually, I hadn't thought of it, but that's an interesting way to look at those kind of 3 stages of the creative process that I was thinking about earlier. So in that process where you might get close to a flow state is in that sort of middle area, which you hear the term like a lightning strikes, like, and the whole idea kind of comes out at once. And I do think that can happen to an extent, but it's not, for me at least, it's not like I was just walking around thinking about something else and all of a sudden I had like an entire piece of music in mind. It's like I was trying to create something, and then all of a sudden things just click. And now I'm like, oh, I think I can see the beginning, middle, and end of this and all the major pieces of this idea. And the challenge for me personally is trying to get that documented somewhere while I'm still in that mindset. Because if it's something that I do half of, and then I walk away or I come back, and then I'm looking at that from a slightly different like worldview, sometimes that's gone. And now I have half of an idea that I'm not really able to kind of run with. So that would be really close it's almost like your intuitive mind, your fast mind just can get it, and your slow mind is like convinced enough, like that's going to work, go. All systems go, get it out, document it in a way where it's good to be practiced with your pen and paper, whatever way that you can think really flexibly, get it all out. And then once you have that kind of basic blueprint architecture of the idea, then you can come in with your slow mind after the fact and really embellish it and make it full and rich as an idea, without straying too much from that thing that your fast mind just suddenly got and could see this whole piece of work in kind of one idea. So I imagine with an application or a service design piece, there would be definitely room for that, where that aha moment where things kind of come together. It'd be really interesting to see like an fMRI study of somebody coming up with like an aha idea and what the brain is actually doing.
So that's kind of what I was describing as like there's that processing time where you consider a load of inputs and then you just step away from it, and usually for me it's then going to bed or jogging, and then I get that aha moment, but it is preceded by a lot of thought. And I know that if I don't write that thing down then it's probably gone, or it's going to take a long time to get back to that point. So I will write that down, usually on my notes on my phone, and then the next day I'll go through it again, and with my deliberate mind, I'll figure that one out.
That's really interesting that you brought up jogging, and that's not just a coincidence that would help you kind of work through an idea. And there's a lot of things that you can do if you feel like you're sitting in that you're in this ambiguous space. There is some cool idea in there somewhere, but it's that needle in a haystack kind of thing. You're just getting burnt out, tunnel vision. Being able to have some sort of like escapism activity that allows you to just put that aside, do something else, can be the best way to get to that aha moment. And the basic premise is that a lot of that decision is happening in the front of your brain here. That's where a lot of your personality is, and a lot of your decision making kind of happens here. And if you're jogging, or for me it's come with doing like yard work, working with my hands, doing something that's like requires attention, but it's not like 100% of my focus. Swimming is a thing. That's probably swimming has been huge. If I could put on like resistance bands so I can just like literally just focus on breathing, then like my mind can just kind of go all sorts of directions. And what it does is kind of take the pressure off the decision-making part of your brain and just sort of work your like motor cortexes and like other parts of your brain enough that it allows your kind of decision making and like creative part of your brain to just sort of like wander off. And then usually it can be something where suddenly you're kind of, it seems random, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, note that for later, after I get kind of back into that place, this might work. And that's happened for me a lot. I hear that with a lot of creators and people trying to come up with ideas where it's like, I didn't come up with this during Crazy Eights, but I was like just about to drift off to sleep, or I was reading, or I was on my bike, and then I was like, oh man, I should have said that. Like I wish I'd come up with that sooner. And it's like, well, you came up with that in the right way. Like you were mulling over it, you're still thinking about it, kind of gave yourself that space, and sometimes that's what it takes for that, just that aha moment, that lightning strike to happen. And people got to figure out what really works for them to be just maximizing their output. Like what's that environment?
It's like a leap of faith. It's like you have to just leave a gap and just trust that your brain will figure it out. And it's kind of similar to, say, I've lost my keys, or I can't think of an actor's name, or something like that.
Oh yeah.
I just kind of ask myself the question, think about it a little bit, and then just let it go. And then it will just sometimes pop into your head. It's kind of similar. You have to trust that there's something happening there.
There is a lot of trust. And that's, for me, especially if you have a deadline, this then becomes really hard. And that's where it's going to be great to have like a creative routine that you can trust, because there's going to be that voice in your head that's like, do something else. We don't have enough time to do this, period. And now you're going to want to take time and go do something else. But if you recognize you have tunnel vision, you're not getting to that part of the creative process where you feel like you can just run and you have the idea that might be able to work and that you want to run with, having some sort of way to balance that out, whether, yeah, it's like questions you can ask yourself. I mean, there's no shortage of literature and methodologies and techniques and things that people swear by as, a way to get past that creative block. And I mean, I would just encourage everybody to try them all and figure out what's going to work for you. They're all not going to work, but if you can figure out those common things that you can go to, I'm going to go through these questions, or yeah, I just need to get away. I need to work my body. I need to sleep on it, like whatever is going to work for you. And that could change even with a different project or different situation. But if you have a deadline and you have something that's really high stress, you need to kind of keep working, you're in that tunnel vision, that's when it's going to be great for you to have a really solid routine, for you to be able to just kind of like pump the brakes a little bit, realign, and then you can get back into it full steam, as opposed to just burning out, getting further and further into that idea you've already ruled out, but you can't think of anything else, and then you're just spinning your wheels, and that's not a good place to be.
Well, I guess if you do have a deadline, I think that's when, like you say, you rely on process. And if we go back to the music analogy, you would probably go back to theory, right? If you had a deadline to make a piece of music, rather than sit there and try and intuit something new, you would probably go with a chord progression that you know and then put a twist on it.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to think about it. Like, there's a lot of frameworks, and like usually early on, I'll have a sense of the type of piece I'm going to write. And does that piece is there like a known structure? Like something that you might hear a lot about is like ABA, to describe like one idea, a contrasting idea, and then the same idea as the start, or some different version of it. So yeah, usually you have a sense of like the meta structure of the idea, and yeah, being able to kind of pull on things in the past, or understand like, okay, I'm writing a piece that's really similar to these types of work, and if you know who those composers are and who those creators are and what they were doing, then that kind of gives you a lot to work with in terms of being like, well, I can't copy them, but I mean, for me, what I always think about is like, what did I love listening to? So like, if I was working within this style of music, like, what's another piece in that style of music that I remember being like, oh, that's magic. How did they do that? That idea spoke to me, that resonated with me. So I like to sit and just kind of play with whatever paradigms are out there, whether it's a structure to the piece or something like that. And yeah, having that kind of, that grammar makes it, of music theory, makes it a lot easier to just like think through abstract ideas in a way that when you do get that idea, now I can like write it down. And even if that's writing it down on a piece of paper in like music theory, it's not like something where it's like, oh, I need to get to my instrument and sound this out, and then my ears will know when it's right, because I have no other way to explain it. But being able to just write that down in a couple letters and numbers makes it so much easier to kind of workshop ideas like that.
Yeah. So do you have any like guiding principles or analogies that you keep close, that you picked up from your days making music and now applying those to design?
Yeah, great question. I think two would be, there's the idea of a foreground, middle ground, and background of composition, and an idea about the line, which is like a term that one of my professors, Professor Stephen Jaffe at Duke University, kind of instilled in me. But thinking about foreground, middle ground, background is probably rooted in psychology more than anything else. And it's again kind of going back to different ways of thinking and perceiving things. Your brain can only focus on so much. And especially if you're looking at a big piece of music that's like big orchestra, you might have a lot of different sounds coming at you. Your ear, and your ear really being your brain, is going to be focusing on that stuff in the foreground. And thinking about, especially like digital design, but also in like terms of mental modeling, what a customer or a user is going to be focused on throughout a process is really, really similar. And there are a lot, I think, especially in perception, when you look at, like, think about the idea of a style guide and simply wanting to like limit and reduce the number of like fonts that you have or colors that you're using to kind of fit certain purposes. a way to interpret that might be keeping a consistent background so that you don't have to think too much when you go from one page to the next. You don't want to have people thinking like, oh, am I in a different app? Because everything just changed. The whole background just changed. And they might not be able to piece together. It's like, oh, different background shade and the fonts are a little bit different and things are treated, buttons now behave differently, things I have to interact with differently. So having really like consistent backgrounds and being in control of what's in the foreground and kind of having a sense of what you want customers to be focused on, that's definitely something that I think would find not just in music, but in a lot of different types of art. And then that's where you can get, at least in music, you can get really, like I love having interplay between like the foreground and the middle ground of the piece. So you have, things that are happening that are kind of keeping pace and setting up the big idea. And then you're focused on something and you have something else like just below the surface that can like kind of keep your interest and they can switch. You have like a middle ground idea that suddenly comes up and is in the foreground.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think is really true in design. And the second one is this idea of the line, which is my professor studied in France, I think, or he spoke French. His professor was French, so this might be lost in translation a little bit. But he would always talk about removing air pockets from my piece. And he was describing that, if you think about the foreground as being the thing that somebody is paying attention to through time, from the start to the end of the piece, the line is a way to describe what that idea is. And that might be changing between instruments or changing what it is, but there is something that is kind of keeping the audience's interest and that they're going to be focusing on as all this stuff is happening. And the idea of removing air pockets or like turbulence is like if you get to an idea and it takes 10 seconds to kind of tell the idea, but by 6 seconds in, you kind of get the gist and you know how it's going to end. He would always be challenging me like, can you make this less? Can you get that same idea across less? Because by this point, I might be losing interest. I get the idea and now you're going to keep going on, but I'm thinking about something else. But if you make it right into the next idea, then it's kind of shaving off all of that, unnecessary stuff that might be where your audience loses attention. And you hear this in design as the mantra, design is done when there's nothing left to take away. You want to pull back anything that's really going to be a cause of distraction or something that's not on point with whatever the journey is, the task is that people are trying to do. And that's something that I think is it can be a little bit more abstract when it comes to music, but often, like if you have like a solo instrument or like a singer and a piano, the singer is carrying the line almost always. And the piano might have some moments here or there, but you want to make sure there isn't a part of the song where the singer's just kind of going off and people have that moment that's like, okay, this is long. Like I have things to do, or, oh, I didn't realize the lights on the ceiling were like that. Like those are moments where you've lost the line is not good. You've lost the attention of the audience. And I think there's, especially in digital design, there's a lot of ways of looking at, somebody traveling through an app or a website with, the thing that you want them to be focused on, and that they're looking for, that they want to be focused on as well.
Yeah. I think you've just given a lot more depth and character to something that I thought I knew quite well already as a designer. Like my take on that is a lot more shallow and superficial, but I still felt was pretty good. Was that when we talk about an intuitive interface, I don't think you can really have a truly intuitive interface, but I think what we're talking about is really closing the gap between what you're seeing and having to analyze, and like how quickly you can process that stuff. So if you are using a style guide and it is consistent and the experience is familiar and you don't have to think about it, you're closer to intuitive. And then you can directly use his attention to those focal points. So I guess to draw a contrast between, or a similarity between what you was just describing, the familiarity and the intuition is kind of the background. It's something you don't really need to observe or process. at the line is where you're guiding their attention. It's how you're drawing them through the interface to complete the goal. I think you've just given a whole new dimension to that idea, which I'm quite interested to now go away and think about.
I'm glad that resonated. I think an important difference, which is worth noting, is that when you have an audience that's sitting and listening to a piece of music, they all are experiencing that in time at the same pace. And a big challenge in digital design is that you can't assume that. And this is, I think, such an important part of UX design, and having like a mature UX practice that can recognize you are not your users, and that your users are a dynamic group of people that you need to be staying in touch with, and to have some way of looking at different types of users as they're coming through your platform or whatever it is, that you might be dealing with somebody who is going to go in page A, B, C, D in order, focus the whole way through, and you can measure how long that's going to take, and maybe there's a little bit of, people do it a little bit faster, a little bit slower. You have another person who has a baby, and they are trying to do this, and life is interrupting them constantly, or they're switching between apps because they're kind of doing something else at the same time. So that line could be a totally different experience for somebody in group A, group B, group C, whatever it is. And I think for me, that's been a really interesting challenge to try to design for, where you want people to be focused on whatever it is that you are creating for them. Similar with music, like I wouldn't want somebody in my audience like picking up the phone and, pulling out their phone and doing something else. Usually that doesn't happen in, like a stage and audience people are there and they're focused in some way. But in digital design, it's just the opposite. Like people are in just this wilderness of doing all sorts of stuff in different orders, at different paces, and at any point their phone dies, and suddenly they're going to pick it up 3 hours later in a totally different headspace. Yeah. And you have to be that much more flexible with kind of keeping things in the foreground and background. So I think it actually makes it that much more important to be really clean with digital design and having very clear foregrounds and lines that people can kind of follow through, so that this is my train stop. Suddenly I'm very much aware of how my stuff is all over the place, and I need to like piece all this together, and then I finally get to where I'm going and I pull it up again. Can you pick up right back off where you were and kind of keep going through without it being this whole reset? So it's an interesting difference. It's been a new challenge getting into UX.
Yeah, it's like trying to compose a piece of music for a room full of people that all want something different at different times and different mind states. They're not all prepared to come and listen to a piece of music.
Yeah, this might be where you get, for me, I'd go like death metal. Something that you're gonna listen. You're gonna listen to this one.
Yeah. Mate, that was such a great conversation. I really enjoyed that. I got a lot out of that one.
So this has been great to get all these ideas kind of together. It's been quite the journey, and I always find myself thinking about my classical music days and all that training. Yeah. So I'm happy I was able to share a lot of that with you today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been quite enlightening in a few ways, and I always like reflecting on these things myself and like developing a philosophy. I think I've got a few things that I can take forward there. So thanks for your time, mate. And
excited to see what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me.
So that's all for this episode. I'll put a few links to Sharif's music in the description. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.